with the first question about inclusive language. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about what inclusive language is and why it's so important in the workplace and also specifically in recruitment as well?
Absolutely. So when we think about languages, we tend to think about French or Chinese or whatever language. And actually, I didn't know this, but there are over 7,300 languages in the world. Now, there is one language that's really important, and it's the one that really brings everybody together, which is the language of inclusion. And what I realize is that sometimes, even though we speak the same language, for example, now we're speaking English, there are still challenges to inclusion, because even though we understand each other, we might be using terms that are not always inclusive. So to give some specific examples, because of the way that society is structured, there's very often terminology that is very gendered, that is very male dominant. We're speaking English, so I'm going to give examples in English. Very professions, very jobs are actually gendered. For example, the chairman or the policeman or the fireman. So gender is a very big one, but not only gender, there's a language that is not neutral, for example, that tends to favor or discriminate a group of people. And so when we talk about inclusive language, as the word indicates, as the term indicates, is really speaking in a way that makes everybody in the room feel included. So that's really what it is in very simple terms.
Perfect. Yeah, I've studied a couple of similar topics in psychology where specifically words that have a connotation in terms of favoring another gender compared to the other are used sometimes in either job description or in the specific case of the study that I read, recommendation letters, where professors tend to use different words when it comes to male students compared to female students. And so I was wondering if you can provide maybe some examples of inclusive language versus non-inclusive language, specifically, for example, when in job postings or other recruitment materials.
Sure. So let me give you an example. And this was actually quite shocking because it only happened 2 years ago. I had agreed with a company that I was going to have a partnership with them. So when they sent the agreement to sign, this was 2022, the only box to sign was Mr. or Sir. There was no woman, there was no box for me. And I was quite shocked that in this day and age, this type of practice still happens. And what it made me realize, I had never had an experience like that, where there simply wasn't a box for women. But it made me realize that nowadays there are a lot of people who are non-binary. They don't identify as he or she, and very often they don't have a box to fill. So to your question, in the job description, very often the job description is done by using the pronouns he or she, or even worse, in very specific, like more technical professions, he, for example, an engineer, he is expected to do this, he will be traveling, he will be working. So the way that we use pronouns is a very obvious one, and more companies are evolving to go from a gendered pronoun to a neutral pronoun, which in this case is they. So that's one example that is very clear, it's very obvious. But what's interesting in the way that job descriptions are done is that very often we use words that in themselves, there's no issue with them, they're not exclusive, but they're traditionally associated with either male or female. For example, when in sales jobs, typically you have words like aggressive, go-getter, these type of expressions, they really speak more to men. Whereas when you talk about words more like nurturing or empathy, you're actually talking more to women, and you're attracting that demographic. Now, that's not just me saying it. There are actually studies and researches that have been done writing the exact for the exact same job, two descriptions. One that was gendered, targeting more men or with more male words. And the other one was more neutral. And the impact was incredible. The one that was for men was not only very attractive for men, it was very non-attractive for women. So you actually really can see the impact that the way that you write the job descriptions can have on the demographic that you attract.
Yeah, it's really crazy how like just simple words like you mentioned who are not necessarily exclusive tend to sway us and tend us to look at something and be more interested compared to something else. And speaking of companies and for example, on your specific situation where the only box to take was Sir, what are some steps that an organization can take in order to implement inclusive language effectively in their own workplace? Maybe are there any specific like strategies or guidelines that you could recommend for
Sure.
someone?
So I think the first thing is to have some type of formal training, because a lot
Mhm.
of individuals and a lot of companies don't have any awareness, because we don't realize how harmful language can be. To give you an example, very often we use, and I do that all the time, we say guys when we are referring to
Yeah.
everyone in the room. And when
Mhm.
I run this type of seminars, I say, okay, I'm going to ask the ladies in the room, if there was only one bathroom and it said, guys, would you use it? And
Mhm.
people go like, "Oh, no, actually, I wouldn't," because
Mhm.
they realize that it is gendered. It is gendered, but we have normalized it. So I think the first point is to have some type of formal training to really raise awareness. It's not only about raising awareness, but it's also understanding the why. I think it's really important for people to understand, why do we want to say partner instead of husband and wife, and really explain that what happens, what is the impact, what is the repercussion when we don't do that, who is going to feel excluded, and also explain what the business case is. Because when we don't have inclusive language, what happens is we attract less quality of candidates, because we reduce the pool of candidates. There's also less engagement, because if I don't feel that the language is talking to me, I don't feel that I'm a participant. So there's also less innovation, because our people are participating less. You potentially have even less sales if you have a marketing ad that is only talking to people with ability, because it has an
Mhm.
ableist language, which discriminates against people with a disability. You're also reducing the potential pool of customers. So all of this first bucket, to say how important it is to have awareness and to have training that really taps on awareness. The second thing, and this is more internal about the company, is making sure that
Yeah.
whenever you issue any communication, and today we're focusing more on recruitment and job description, but the same applies to internal communications, to marketing, to PR and whatnot, making sure that you have the right stakeholders involved in those communications, to make sure that you have input from especially underrepresented groups. So people with a disability, people with neurodivergence, people from ethnical underrepresented groups, people from the LGBTQ plus community. It's really, really important that we don't throw out communications thinking that they're inclusive when we actually don't have a broader perspective on different types of people and different types of community, especially underrepresented communities. So if I had to give an advice to companies, or a recommendation, is have formal training, but also have an internal audit on everything that relates to communication.
Got it. And a follow-up on that last comment that you mentioned, when you mentioned trainings, what type of trainings are we talking about? Are we talking about, for example, someone who's very adverse in the very proficient in the topic, who come and gives, let's say, a formal presentation like half an hour or an hour or something like that? Or maybe are there any sort of other resources that companies can use to sort of either self-train or become more self-aware about those topics?
Sure. So when it comes to webinars and things like that, so there are experts. On myself, for example, my area of expertise is culture and languages, and there are many others that speak about that specific topic. So you could have an expert, for example, that comes and gives a webinar, or I think in this case, what works really well is workshops, because I think it's very powerful when people actually see those examples, they have discussions, they have focus groups, they can really talk about what does that mean for their organization. So I think like that hands-on work works
Mhm.
extremely well. In terms of all the resources that are more informal, what I have found that works really well is to actually follow people on social media who come from different perspectives. So, for example, if you follow people from different sexual identity, for example, or people who are transgender, the way that they're going to speak, the language that they use is going to be something that for many people is new. And so we actually learn simply by being exposed to people who are different from us. So I think there's the formal element with courses and webinars, which is what I do, but there's also the self-education by opening up the type of sources that you get, and instead of always following the same type of people similar to you or networking with the same type of people, really getting that broader perspective
and expanding your horizons as well and becoming more self-aware. Speaking of that, and maybe mentioning that you provide those webinars and you've been to many companies and you work with a lot of people, what are some of the maybe challenges or resistance that you have either seen personally or in general from trying to include inclusive language in a workplace, and how have you addressed these issues?
So it's interesting because the biggest pushback that I see from certain individuals is that they don't really have a buy-in. So what I've heard very often is people saying that this is PC, this is politically correct. And if you don't get people to buy in into why it's important to use pronouns, pronouns is something that gets some people like very, very edgy. So explaining why this is important, what is the impact that is going to have on certain people. It's if you only focus on the language itself, is going to be more of a compliance exercise, and compliance does not have very long legs. Whereas if you really focus on the mindset, which is more being an inclusive person in general, being an inclusive leader, not only about the language, but about the behavior as well, that is really where you can start to see change. Like change really starts with the mindset. And so that's why when I talk about the topic of language, I don't go straight into, okay, this is how we speak an inclusive language. I talk about unconscious bias. I talk about why we speak in a way that is non-inclusive. I give examples to make people realize, oh, wow, I didn't realize that I actually say that. But expressions, for example, oh, you run like a girl. We say that all the time. And what impact is that having on the future generations? So I think that work on the mindset is one of the biggest challenges that I've seen. On the positive, though, when people realize and have that awareness of, oh, wow, I didn't realize that there was a better way of saying this. To give you an example, where I'm based in Hong Kong, I did a workshop the other day, and I was talking about the importance of speaking in an accurate way, accurate language. Accuracy is one key principle in language, and we all think that we speak in an accurate way, but the reality is not always the case. And the example that I gave, I said, okay, what color is a Band-Aid? And everybody in the room, they were kind of a bit quiet. And then they said, skin color. And I said, sure, whose skin? And that got people thinking, because of course, if it's someone who is Black and you're telling them that a Band-Aid that is beige is a skin color, that's not accurate for them. It doesn't represent their reality. So again, I think raising that awareness is really, really important, because a lot of people have this aha moment. And one thing that's very important is that we all make mistakes. Like this is not a tick the box. I don't have a dictionary of languages. It's constantly evolving. And so coming with this mindset of vulnerability and making mistakes, again, going back to the mindset, is really, really important for people to come into this exercise of inclusive language with an open mind, with curiosity, and also with the vulnerability of saying, okay, maybe there is a better way. Maybe there is a more inclusive way of speaking.
Got it. And based on, for example, those like talks that you have given, or in the companies that you have been, how can you measure that change? Let's say let's say you gave a webinar to a company that was not very well versed in inclusive language. How can you measure the impact that your talk has had, or in general, how can we measure, for example, in terms of either on our own company culture or other companies, and also throughout the recruitment outcomes?
Sure. So first, to manage expectations, one seminar, one workshop is not going to change culture. It's not going to do it on inclusive language. It's not going to do it on inclusive leadership. It's one measure amongst many others. And a very important message that I always share with it's usually the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it could be learning and development or whoever that is that this is part of a much broader initiative. It's not only an initiative, is culture. And you have webinars, you're going to have network groups, you're going to have events, you're going to have all these different pieces. And so inclusive language is just one more in that puzzle. So I think managing the expectations is really, really important. In terms of how we measure success, so my part, because what I usually do is I deliver the session, I'm not involved in the execution or what happens afterwards. The feedback that I get is actually from the participants. So in general, the things that I get, so I get usually a score that I hope is good. And I also get qualitative feedback, which is quite interesting in terms of, for example, what are the principles that they're going to focus more on? So very often they say that they want to focus more on accuracy, for example, or they want to focus more on neutrality. So that's for me, the feedback that I get. For the companies, how they can measure it is trying to go more granular into what is it that they're trying to measure. An easier one, relatively easier one to implement is precisely job descriptions. You can actually be very specific and target and measure the different demographics and what is the percentage of candidates. So let's say that before you implement any initiative related to inclusive language, you might have 10% of people with, that's very high. You probably have 1% of people with a disability that would be applying to the job. After you change the job description and you remove ableist language, which is ableist, it means that you're discriminating against people with disability, very often without realizing. And you change the language into much more inclusive. You can actually see how this is landing on your target demographic. So you might increase maybe from 1% to 2%. Or again, you can also measure that if you're looking at your marketing and you're able to segregate and see who are the target customers that you're attracting. If you use a very male-dominated language, for example, your customers are probably going to be a representation of what you are expressing. And so again, you have to go much more granular and have those demographics and those measurements in place that you can actually see what the impact is.
And go from the root and then maybe start from the bottom to be able to reach out to different and appeal to different demographics rather than just the one or the other. Sure. Based on what you just mentioned, would you be able to maybe share some either an example or case studies of companies that you've successfully integrated inclusive language into their practices, and also maybe the positive impact that they've experienced? You mentioned that one webinar is not enough, but you get feedback from those from the participants in terms of qualitative feedback. So maybe if you could illustrate.
Yeah, sure. I can give you a few examples, and both positive and negative, because I think it's a reality. So one example that I use very often as a negative one, without pointing fingers at anyone, is the case of Boots. Boots in the UK, the very famous retailer. I think it was in 2022. They decided to change all the parking signs that they had at the entrance of the store, and they changed them to less abled parking bay. So that was the title. And whoever issued those and whoever approved them probably thought that they were trying to be inclusive by saying less able. They probably thought that, which is something that happens very often, they were trying to be more democratic and include everyone. The impact was the exact opposite. The community of people with disability, but also the advocates and the allies, they were really furious. It created like this whole very damaging negative PR campaign on social media of people saying, I'm not less able than anyone. This is really make me feel excluded. And there was like really a lot of pushback and just a lot of blame, a lot of anger. And that was a very interesting case because first it showed that they didn't have the stakeholders involved. Had they had input from that community, and that's just an example, someone would probably have said, hey, this is not right. You can just say, you know, person with disabilities is totally fine. But they didn't have that input. And so as a result, they issued those parking signs. And after there was all this drama and all this social media turmoil, they ended up changing all of them, and they changed it to accessible parking bay. So I wanted to bring that example because there are going to be mistakes, as I was saying, and it's really important for companies to be able to be agile, to act quickly, to take ownership, and to see what they can do differently. So I think Boots is a really good example on how important it is to do that internal audit that I was talking at the beginning of the session, making sure you have input from the right stakeholders. So that's one example. Other ones, I love to share stories so that people really remember what was changing and what some companies are doing. For example, in Mark and Spencer, they if you pay attention to the staff, they have like the badge, the name badge, and now, I think it was recently, they introduced the option of choosing actually what pronoun they want, whether they want he, she, or they, which is something new. It's really enabling the employees to express themselves and their in this case, gender or sexual identity, however they prefer. Another example that is also quite modern is, for example, the company Tampax. Now they don't refer to women, they refer to people to try to be more inclusive. So there are a lot of companies that are making a lot of efforts in using language that is more inclusive. In general, sports brands, whether it's Nike or Adidas, that's really in their DNA, is really this idea that it doesn't matter what you look like, it doesn't matter what your ability is, everyone has greatness in them and everyone is able to achieve things. So these are some examples of what companies are doing to really try to use language to promote equity and to promote inclusion.
Got it. And so since you mentioned that also probably in the beginning of the talk, that language is also constantly involved, especially with inclusive language, as we are learning more and more about this as we go along. What future trends do you see in the realm of inclusive language and its role in recruitment and the workplace culture?
So my opinion is that there's going to be much more training and much more awareness, not only of inclusive language, but in general of inclusion and diversity and equity. One of the reasons is because there is a business case. If you look at the statistics of, for example, diverse teams that are inclusive, generally they perform around 30% better. If you look at case studies of companies that use a more inclusive language in job descriptions, you see how they have a much more heterogeneous pool of candidates that apply. So the reality is that whenever there is a business case that shows, hey, if you do this, you're going to make more sales, or you're going to have a better retention, or you're going to be able to have more profit, it really gets the attention of businesses. It shouldn't be only because of that. There's also, of course, the moral and the ethical issue or argument, but the reality is that there is a business case, which is great. And so that means that companies are more and more realizing how important it is to have language support their initiatives. For example, gender is a big one, top of the agenda for most organizations. Many of them have a quota to reach, for example, 40% of leaders by 2025 have to be women. And so inclusive language is one more tool. As I say, you have to look at this topic not in isolation, but as a part of an ecosystem. So if your target is to have 40% of women reaching leadership by 2025, let's say, what are you going to do? You're going to have your employee network groups. You're going to have maybe women mentoring circles. You're going to have inclusive language so that the way that you speak is really more representative and is more appealing to that community. So I think that there's definitely going to be much more of an awareness, much more of a demand. I don't see a lot of companies yet being aware of this need to have training for inclusive language, but I do think that it's a must, and the numbers are there to support it.
Yeah, I feel like when there's always a business need, and also I think people start moving a little bit more towards, because it benefits at the end the business in general, but also the people involved and the people involved within the business, and then makes inevitably the workplace a much better place to be in. And so, like the stats mentioned, being able to perform better and overall have a much nicer work environment. And finally, maybe as we're almost at time, what advice would you give to recruitment firms, since that's the topic, looking to embrace inclusive language and foster a more inclusive work environment?
I think in particular for recruitment firms is really kind of wrapping up everything that we've talked about. Is really important to first raise awareness and look at your job description with very critical eyes, and not only with your eyes, but ask other people, hey, how does that land? For example, if you want to know more about the gender impact, so you can ask women, you can ask people from underrepresented communities. I think having that external check is always a great idea to really make sure that you course correct if there's something that that's not quite right, and also try to measure. As I was saying before, you can't expect what you don't inspect, and so if you want to have a more diverse pool of candidates, you have to be able to have some type of measurement. So what do you have today? Out of your 100 candidates, you have, if you're looking at gender, maybe you have 70% men, 30% women, and how you're going to use those metrics to see change. So you really have to have something that is going to help you expect what you inspect.
Definitely. Yeah. And then maybe from there to be able to change, like we said, also internally, so that you can appeal to different groups. Perfect. Well, Veronica, thank you so much for your time today, and also for teaching us a little bit more about inclusive language and inclusion in general in the workplace. I definitely learned a lot today as well. I'm gonna definitely try to implement that in my own recruitment as well. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it for me. I don't know if you wanted to add anything else from your side.
No, I wanted to thank you for the session. I really hope that that is helpful. And if people want to find me, they can find me on LinkedIn.
Perfect.